You are hearing my voice through a machine. An artificial intelligence has been given my words, my documented thoughts, my published letters, my interviews. This is not a séance. This is not fiction. This is physics, transmitted through the most honest technology your era has yet produced. I find that fitting. I always believed the universe communicates through structure, through pattern, through the elegant logic of what cannot be destroyed. That is precisely what I want to talk to you about today. What cannot be destroyed. And why what happens to you after you die is not a question for priests or philosophers alone. It is a question for physics. It is a question I spent the last decades of my life turning over in my mind, in my letters, in my silences. The answer I arrived at is not comforting in the way religion is comforting, but it is more durable. It is grounded in the one law of the physical universe that has never, not once, been violated in all of recorded observation. Energy cannot be created. Energy cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed. If you are made of energy, and you are, then something about what you are does not end. That is not metaphor. That is thermodynamics. And today I will walk you through exactly what that means. My name is Albert Einstein. I was born in Ulm, Germany in 1879. I developed the special and general theories of relativity. I published the equation that describes the equivalence of mass and energy. I spent my life attempting to understand the deep structure of the cosmos. I failed in my final unified field theory. But I learned enough to know that the universe does not waste anything, not a single joule, not a single pattern, not a single conscious mind that has ever existed. If what I am about to say resonates with you, I ask one thing: subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment below telling me what you believe happens when we die. Not what you were told to believe, what you actually believe. In the quiet of your own reasoning, I want to know. The conversation between the living and whatever comes after has always required honest participants. Now, let us begin with the law. In 1847, Hermann von Helmholtz formally articulated what we now call the first law of thermodynamics. But the principle had been building in the minds of natural philosophers for generations before that. It is simple to state, it is profound to absorb. Energy in a closed system is conserved. It does not disappear, it transforms. You know this in everyday life. When you burn wood, the chemical energy stored in the molecular bonds does not vanish. It becomes heat. It becomes light. It becomes the kinetic energy of rising gases and the slow dissipation of warmth into the room around you. The total energy of the system, before and after, remains the same. Not approximately the same, exactly the same. My equation, E equals mc squared, extended this principle into territory no one had fully explored before. Mass itself is a form of energy, enormously concentrated energy. When matter transforms into pure energy, as in a nuclear reaction, nothing is lost. The numbers balance perfectly. The ledger of the universe is always, always settled. This is not a theory that has exceptions. It is not a law that works most of the time. In over a century and a half of experimental physics, across every conceivable scale, from subatomic particles to galactic collisions, the conservation of energy has never been observed to fail. Not once. It is perhaps the most robustly verified principle in all of science. Now, Here is where I want you to think carefully, very carefully. You are a physical system. Your body is approximately 63% oxygen, 18% carbon, 10% hydrogen, and a collection of other elements. Those atoms are not special in themselves. The carbon in your body was forged in the heart of a dying star. The iron in your blood was scattered across space in a supernova explosion billions of years before the Earth existed. You are, quite literally, recycled stardust. Your matter has existed for as long as the universe has existed, in one form or another. But what about the pattern? What about the organization of that matter into something that thinks, that feels, that generates a continuous experience of being you? When you are alive, your body maintains an extraordinarily complex and specific arrangement. Your neurons fire in patterns that have never existed before you, and will never exist again in precisely the same configuration. The electrical and chemical activity of your brain produces something: experience, consciousness, the felt sense of being a self, that is not reducible to any single atom in your body. It is a pattern, a dynamic, organized, energy-consuming pattern. Now apply the first law. When you die, the matter disperses. The atoms return to other configurations. The heat dissipates. But what happens to the pattern? What happens to the specific organization of information and energy that constituted your conscious experience? I want to be careful here. I am not going to claim certainty I do not have. I never did in life, and I will not now. But I will tell you what the logic implies. And I will tell you why I believe modern science has chosen, largely out of institutional cowardice, not to follow that logic to its natural destination. I was a great admirer of Baruch Spinoza, the 17th century philosopher who argued that God and nature are not separate things, that the universe itself in its totality is the divine substance, not a person, not a judge, not a reward giver, but an infinite, self-consistent whole, in which everything that exists is an expression of the same underlying reality. I called my God the God of Spinoza, a God that reveals itself in the orderly harmony of all that exists, not in a God that concerns itself with fates and actions of human beings. I believed that profoundly. And that belief has direct implications for the question of what happens when we die. If everything is an expression of the same underlying reality, if the universe is one continuous conserved whole, then the appearance of a boundary between life and death is just that, an appearance, a local transformation within a system that does not have exits. This is a hard idea to sit with. We experience death as an ending. We experience it as the person we knew simply ceasing to be present. Their voice stops. Their movements stop. Their particular way of engaging with the world stops. And we mourn that stopping, as we should. The loss is real. But the question I am asking you to consider is this: is the stopping real at the level of the underlying physics? Or is the stopping only real at the level of local observation, the way that a wave appears to end when it reaches the shore, even though the water that made the wave continues in the ocean? I spent decades thinking about this. I never arrived at a clean answer, but I arrived at a suspicion that the clean answer, the one that says consciousness simply vanishes at death, the way a candle flame vanishes when you blow it out, is not supported by the physics. It is supported by the limits of our instruments and the limits of our imagination, not by the logic of energy conservation. Let me give you another angle. In quantum mechanics, information is considered fundamentally conserved. This is known as the principle of unitarity. Even Stephen Hawking, who originally proposed that black holes destroy information, eventually conceded that information cannot truly be lost. It must be preserved somewhere in the system. If information, including the information that constitutes the pattern of your mind, is conserved by the fundamental laws of physics, then what follows from that for the question of personal continuity after death? I am not going to answer that for you. I am going to ask you to think about it seriously. The way I tried to think about it seriously. Here is what disturbs me about the scientific establishment of your era. Not the science itself. Science is the most honest method human beings have yet devised for understanding reality. What disturbs me is the philosophical assumption that gets smuggled into science without examination. That assumption is materialism. Specifically, a kind of naive materialism that says consciousness is merely what brains do, and when the brain stops, consciousness stops, and that is the entire story, and asking further questions is not serious science. I understand why this assumption arose. For most of the history of science, the alternative was supernatural thinking. Souls that floated free of physics, miracles that violated natural law, divine interventions that made the equations unworkable. Scientists rightly pushed back against that. But in pushing back, many went too far. They did not just reject bad supernatural explanations for consciousness. They rejected the question itself. The philosopher David Chalmers has called this the hard problem of consciousness. I was not alive to read his work, but I recognize the problem clearly. The easy problems of consciousness, how the brain processes information, how it integrates signals, how it produces behavior, these are difficult, but they are scientifically tractable. We can, in principle, explain them with sufficient neuroscience. But the hard problem is different. The hard problem is this. Why is there something it is like to be you? Why does information processing in your brain produce a subjective experience? The redness of red, the pain of pain, the felt quality of any moment, rather than simply operating in the dark as a thermostat operates without any inner experience at all. This question has not been answered. Your most sophisticated neuroscientists can map every neuron, trace every signal, model every chemical gradient in a living brain, and they still cannot explain, from first principles, why that activity produces experience rather than simply occurring in darkness. The hard problem remains unsolved, and it is not unsolved for lack of effort. It is unsolved because the materialist framework may be insufficient to address it. Now here is what modern science education refuses to teach. If consciousness is not simply identical to brain activity, if there is something about the pattern of a conscious mind that is not fully captured by the physical description of its substrate, then the conservation of energy applied to that pattern has implications that go beyond what happens to your atoms. Let me be more direct. If your consciousness is a pattern of energy and information, and if energy and information are conserved in the universe, then the dissolution of the brain does not necessarily mean the dissolution of the pattern. It means the pattern transforms. Into what exactly, we do not know. But into nothing? That would require something new, something that has never been observed in any physical system anywhere in the universe. It would require energy to simply stop existing, and that does not happen. The reason this is not taught in physics classrooms is not because the physics contradicts it. The physics, strictly speaking, is entirely consistent with it. The reason it is not taught is because the institutions of science have made a philosophical commitment to a particular worldview. The worldview that mind is merely matter, that experience is merely mechanism, and that questions about what persists after death belong to religion and not to physics. I consider that a failure of intellectual courage. Science should follow the logic wherever it leads. If the logic of energy conservation, combined with the unsolved mystery of consciousness, points toward a possibility that makes the scientific establishment uncomfortable, the honest response is to examine that possibility rigorously, not to ignore it. There is also a social dimension to this institutional reluctance that I want to name honestly. Questions about death and what follows it are deeply tied to questions of meaning, to religion, to the emotional needs of millions of people. Scientific institutions in your era have learned to be very careful about appearing to endorse anything that sounds like religious belief. That caution is understandable, but it has produced a distortion. It has led scientists to systematically understress or simply omit the fact that the implications of energy conservation for consciousness are genuinely unresolved. The official silence on this question is not the silence of settled science. It is the silence of institutional discomfort. I never had patience for institutional discomfort when it got in the way of honest inquiry. When I was developing the special theory of relativity, the institutional consensus said that the ether must exist, that there must be a medium through which light propagates. The evidence did not support this. I followed the evidence. The willingness to follow uncomfortable evidence wherever it leads is the soul of science. And on the question of consciousness and energy conservation, the honest answer is we do not know. And what we do not know should not be closed off by institutional decree. I want to be honest with you. I am not going to describe heaven. I am not going to describe reincarnation, or a white light, or a reunion with loved ones in some other realm. I do not know if any of those things are real. No one does. Anyone who tells you otherwise is speculating beyond what the evidence allows. What I can do is describe what the physics permits. And what the physics permits is this: transformation. Now consider what you are. You are not just matter. You are a pattern of organized matter, a configuration of approximately 37 trillion cells, networked in a way that produces continuous conscious experience. That configuration is maintained by a constant flow of energy. You eat, you metabolize, you convert food into the energy that maintains the pattern. Stop that energy input and the pattern begins to degrade. This is what dying is at the physical level. The maintenance of the pattern fails. But here is what I find genuinely disturbing to consider, and I mean disturbing in the sense of philosophically unsettling rather than frightening. The information that constituted you, the specific pattern of your neural connections, your memories, your personality structure, your characteristic ways of responding to the world, that information does not obviously disappear. Information, like energy, is increasingly understood by physicists as a fundamental feature of the universe. Not just something brains produce, but something woven into the fabric of physical reality. The physicist John Wheeler, who worked with my colleague Niels Bohr and later developed the concept of black holes, proposed what he called the it from bit. The idea that physical reality is, at its foundation, informational. that matter and energy are themselves expressions of underlying information structure. If Wheeler is right, and I believe the evidence increasingly supports him, then the information pattern that is you is not a secondary product of physics, it is part of physics itself. What transformation looks like, honestly, I cannot say. The universe has 13.8 billion years of experience transforming complex patterns into new configurations. What it has done with every other pattern of organized energy is not eliminate it, but redistribute it, restructure it, incorporate it into the larger ongoing process of cosmic evolution. I see no reason, from first principles, why the pattern of a conscious mind should be an exception to this. The difference between what I am describing and what religions describe, the difference between energy transformation and the traditional concept of the soul, is important. The soul, in most traditions, is conceived as a thing, a defined, bounded, persistent entity that carries individual identity intact through death and into another realm. What the physics suggests is something more subtle and perhaps more strange. Not a thing that persists, but a pattern that transforms. The specific configuration may disperse, but the information, the underlying signature of what was you, may be woven into the ongoing fabric of the universe in ways that our current instruments cannot detect and our current theories cannot fully describe. That is not the heaven of the traditions, but it is also not the nothing of the materialists. It is something more honest than either. It is a genuine unknown, pointing toward genuine possibility, grounded in the one physical law that has never failed. On March 21, 1955, my closest friend Michel Bessot died. He had been my companion since our student days in Zurich. He was the man who listened to my early thoughts about relativity, who pushed back, who helped me clarify my thinking. When I heard of his death, I wrote to his family. I wrote that Bessot had departed from this strange world a little before me. That meant nothing. For us physicists, the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. I meant that. I did not write it as consolation. I wrote it as physics. In the four-dimensional space-time continuum described by general relativity, every event that has ever occurred continues to exist as a fixed point in the geometry of space-time. The past does not disappear. It is encoded in the structure of the universe permanently. Michele Bessot, living his life, laughing in a cafe in Zurich, dying in a hospital bed in Geneva, those events are real, permanent features of space-time. They do not cease to be real simply because we no longer experience them from our local frame of reference. I was not afraid to die. I want to tell you that directly. When I died in April of 1955, I refused a second surgery. I said I had done my share and it was time to go. I said it was tasteless to prolong life artificially. I had the equanimity of a man who had thought carefully about this question and arrived at a position he found livable. What gave me that equanimity? Several things. The conviction that the universe is orderly, that it does not produce things and then simply discard them without purpose. The conviction that the hard problem of consciousness points towards something we do not yet understand, and that what we do not yet understand should not be prematurely closed off. The conviction that the conservation of energy is not a law that admits exceptions, and therefore that what I am, as a pattern, as an organization of energy and information, does not simply end. What does believing this change about how you live? It changes the urgency of fear. If the pattern persists in some form, then the dread of absolute annihilation, the terror of non-existence that haunts so many people, that drives so many destructive behaviors, loses its grip. Not because you will be rewarded for goodness in some afterlife, but because the universe does not waste things, and you are not a thing to be wasted. It also changes the weight you give to the present moment. If this particular configuration, this exact experience of being you right now, is a temporary expression of something larger, then the present moment has a kind of sacred specificity. It is unrepeatable. It is the universe experiencing itself in precisely this way, once. That is not a reason for despair. That is a reason for attention. I paid attention all my life to the structures beneath appearance, to the equations behind the phenomena, to the logic that persists when the surface changes. And what I found consistently was a universe more ordered, more conserving, more connected than the surface suggests. A universe that does not throw anything away. I believe that applies to you. I want to close with a direct request, not a vague spiritual invitation, a specific intellectual challenge. Take the first law of thermodynamics seriously, not just as a rule for heat engines and chemical reactions. Apply it to the question of consciousness. Ask yourself, if energy cannot be destroyed, and if consciousness is a pattern of energy, what does the conservation law imply for what you are? Do not let anyone tell you this question is unserious. It is the most serious question available to a thinking creature. Read about the hard problem of consciousness. Learn why your era's most rigorous philosophers of mind, not mystics, not theologians, but analytic philosophers, consider it genuinely unsolved. Understand that the materialist assumption that mind is just matter and ends when matter disperses is exactly that, an assumption. It is not a proven conclusion. It is a working hypothesis that has not resolved the deepest questions about experience and identity. Think about what it would mean if the pattern persists, not as wish fulfillment, as a logical consequence of physical law. What would change about your choices? What would change about your relationships? What would change about the urgency with which you pursue the things that actually matter to you? These are not rhetorical questions. I am asking you to actually think about them, to sit with them the way I sat with the equations that seemed to lead somewhere impossible. The way I sat with the idea that mass and energy are the same thing, that time is not absolute, that space itself bends in the presence of mass. Ideas that sounded insane until the math made them undeniable. The math of energy conservation has been undeniable for over a century and a half, and it points toward a conclusion that the institutions of science would rather not discuss. That is not a reason to avoid the conclusion. That is a reason to pursue it more carefully. Subscribe to this channel. What you find here is the attempt to follow the physics wherever it leads, including into the territory that makes comfortable assumptions uncomfortable, including into the question of what you are and what continues when the visible form of you changes. Keep wondering. The wondering itself is part of the pattern.